Hello there and welcome to my tutorial on why and how to create class interfaces. In this video I'm going to be showing code samples in C#, but the principles apply to VB.NET or any other language that uses interfaces. First off, why do we want to create class interfaces? The basic idea is you want to ensure that all of your classes have certain properties or methods so that you can treat them the same way. Right now this may not be 100% clear to you, but I'm going to show you some code that doesn't have interfaces, describe the problem that we have with it, and then add in interfaces to solve the problem. So let's get to the code. Here I have a couple of business objects. The first one is the customer class with an ID, a name, and a contact name. There's a Boolean method isValid that checks to make sure we have some data in there and returns true or false. And then we have a public void method here that saves to the database. Right now I haven't written any code in here, so I've just put a comment. Here's the employee class. It looks pretty much the same as a customer class. We've got some properties, ID, name, and salary, a Boolean method that says isValid, and a void method that saves it to the database. This is how you might use it. Here we instantiate a customer object, set the properties, and then call the customer is valid. If it is valid, we call customer save to database. Same type of thing for the employee. We instantiate employee object, set some properties, and then if it is valid, we save it to the database. Pretty simple code, but we do have a problem here. This violates the DRY principle. The DRY principle, or DRY principle, is something you might hear of in Agile a lot, and it's don't repeat yourself. The idea is if you have the same code in multiple places and you ever have to change the logic behind that, now you've got to go to every place where that code is and make the change. It's going to take you a lot longer than if you just had it in one place. And you also have the possibility of missing one or two of them, which will cause you problems down the line. So going back to our code, if we had 50 different business objects and we suddenly had to change how we do this type of validation and saving, we'd have to make the change in 50 places. Let's say, for example, you have a change in requirements that if you can't save to the database, you need to write to an exception log somewhere. So now you would have to go into your code, write your try catch, move your save up into your try, and then do your call to your error logging code. And in this case you'd have to do it in 50 different places if you had 50 different classes. Makes it very easy to miss something, and if it takes you a minute to make each change, now you're spending 50 minutes to make the change throughout the whole system. Not exactly your ideal situation. So what you would want to do is create a method that does this validation and saving to the database. But the way things are now, we need to have a separate method for each business class. So here in my customer method, I have a validate and save customer method, but it only accepts a customer object. Here for the employee, I have a validate and save employee method, but it only accepts an employee object. We could get a little fancy and create a validate and save object method that accepts an object parameter. We check to see if the object is a customer, then we cast it as a customer to object and call the customer is valid and customer save to DB. If the object is an employee data type, then we cast it as an employee, call the isValid, and call save to DB. This can get long, very quickly. Again, if we have 50 different business objects, suddenly this validate and save object method is 3, 4, 500 lines long. So we're going to use an interface to let us treat the customer and the employee object the same way when we want to validate and save. The first thing we're going to do is add an interface. Go over here to our project, right click, add, new item, and if you scroll down, here you have interface, or it's also under the code section, interface. I'm going to name this iValidatable and Savable. Kind of a standard naming convention for interfaces is they start with a capital I, and then what's after that is kind of a description of what you can do with the object. In this case, iValidatable and Savable, because we want to be able to validate the object and save it to the database. First thing I'm going to do is make the interface public, and then I'm going to define the properties and methods that I want to be available. In this case, it's going to be the Boolean is valid and the void save to DB, since that's what's common, and those are also the methods that we want to use in the method that we're going to share across the business objects. So I go back to the interface and I set the methods that I want. Bool is valid, void save to DB. Now notice that we don't have a public or private or anything like that, because all methods in the interface need to be public. If the methods took parameters, let's say is valid bool check everything was a parameter that we needed, then in our interface we would have to add that to the method signature. But in this case, our methods don't have any parameters, so we won't use them. Now what this interface does is let us say any class that implements this interface, we can treat it as an iValidatable and Savable object, or an object of that data type. So now we have to go and do what's called implementing the interface. We go into our customer class, and up here after we say public class customer colon iValidatable and Savable. So now that means this customer class needs to implement the methods that are listed in iValidatable and Savable. In this case, is valid and save to DB. We already have these here, so we're done. Go to the employee method, do the same thing. iValidatable and Savable. Again, since employee already has is valid and save to DB, we're done. Now we can go back to our workbench, our little test bed of code, and write a new validation method. Public void validate and save, but this time the parameter is going to be iValidatable and Savable, and we're going to say if obj dot, and if you look here on IntelliSense, you've got the normal object the normal object methods, equals, get hash code, get type to string, but you also have isValid and SaveToDB, the two methods that were listed in the iValidatable and Savable interface. So I do if object is valid, object dot save to DB. Now I can go back to the code we have here and just change this to validate and save, and for the employee, validate and save. So this validate and save method will accept any object that implements iValidatable and Savable. In this case, customer and employee both implement it, so it can take either one of those. So now if we had 50 different business classes that implemented this interface, we could send them all to this method. If our boss comes by and says, now I want you to log any errors to when we try to save to the database, then all you have to do is make the change in the one place. And you're done. Pretty easy. You make the change once, you're done in a minute, and you don't have to worry about missing it every other place up here. Besides having methods in the interface, you can also have properties, events, and indexers. If you don't know what an event and indexer is right now, don't worry. 99% of the time, your interface is just going to be properties and methods. So I could have good ID get set. In this case, the customer and the employee classes both already have a good ID with the getter and setter, so they match the method signature. Another thing you could do with properties is only have set or only have get. So here in our customer class, it implements get and set, even though in our interface the only thing we want to have available is get. So if we went back to our code here, where we get the iValidatable and Savable object, now we have ID available to read. But if we try to assign a value, we've got an error because the property ID has no setter, at least according to the interface. It only has a getter. I'm going to get rid of that since we don't really need it. Another nice thing about interfaces is that with a normal class in .NET, you can't do multiple inheritance. You can only inherit from one base class. However, you can implement as many interfaces as you want. So your customer class could have iValidatable and Savable, iLoggable, whatever. As long as it implements the methods and the properties and the events, that's good. And something kind of neat with interfaces is they can implement other interfaces. So here I have iValidatable and Savable. If I wanted to, I could create an iValidatable interface. I could create a separate iSavable interface. can go to iValidatable and Savable and just tell it to implement iValidatable and iSavable. You just put a comma between the different interface names. So now any class that implements iValidatable and Savable has to implement the iValidatable interface and the iSavable. Doesn't really make a big difference here, but sometimes if you start getting complex objects that you need to do a lot of things with, it's nice to break them out into their own separate interfaces. So now you see how you can use an interface to reduce the code you have by letting you treat different objects the same way, because you want to do the same type of thing to each of them, even though it's slightly different in how it's done. In this case, the customer class isValid method checks different things than the employee class isValid method, but they both have an isValid method. That's what's important to you in your actual code. And when you find yourself trying to do the same type of thing with several different objects, now you can use an interface to make your code a little bit cleaner, a little bit smaller, a little bit simpler to work with, which is always nice. Because in 6 months when you come back to make a change to the program, the cleaner it is, the easier it is for you to make that change. If you have any questions or comments, please go to my website, scottlilly.com, SCOTTLILLY, and go to the Contact Me page to send me a message. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope you learned something that will help you in your coding.